Good evening and welcome to Mining the Riches of the Parsha. Tonight is Thursday night, October 10th, 2024. This is a special edition of our Thursday night meeting, and we are honored to have a very special guest tonight. Corrie Sirota is with us, and the topic of this evening is good grief, exclamation mark. Corrie is an experienced social worker specializing in loss, bereavement, and crisis management. She has the degrees of MSW, PSW, and she is a psychotherapist. And Corrie is the clinical director of Myra's Kids Foundation, which many of us had the privilege to learn more about just a few weeks ago. So the idea for this night, first of all, I want to thank Stu Gutman, our executive director, for giving me the idea, is to have Corrie, who is an expert on this subject of bereavement, loss, grieving, mourning. And we're doing it tonight, which is just before Yom Kippur. One of the important aspects of Yom Kippur is the ceremony of Yizkor, of remembering those of our family members who have passed away. And so Corrie is going to be speaking about some very essential elements of how to grieve, how to do it in a way that is healthy for us, that moves us forward. And then after Corrie speaks, I'm going to try to connect some of Corrie's ideas to Jewish sources, Jewish practices like Yizkor, like saying Kaddish, like observing Shiva. And Corrie and I hope to have a bit of a discussion about this. I will ask that if you have any questions or comments, please write them in the chat. And then after both of us present, we will go through as many of the questions and comments as we are able to do. The schedule is for us to take about an hour to have together tonight. So I am grateful to Corrie Sirota for agreeing to appear with me tonight and to share your expertise with all of us. And it is my honor and real pleasure to introduce Corrie Sirota.
Thank you so much. I'm going to actually put something in the chat. I just did, which is what I'm going to start with. But before I even go there, I have to tell you that I'm really, aside from being really touched and honored to be invited to do this, it takes a lot of courage to show up at a topic that's called good grief. It's because we know that, or I certainly have seen it in my work and life, that we try and avoid this topic like the plague, and yet we know it's inevitable. So I'm going to throw out a lot of concepts here, something that I would typically do in a 3 or plus hour workshop. So I'm going to talk really fast because I want to just throw out some of this information to you. And then, like the rabbi said, he'll jump in, and then we'll see how do we make sense of it. So I tried to think about how I can show it and demonstrate it in a very succinct way. So here's kind of what I came up with. That it starts with those 4 principles. And if you see in the chat, the first thing I want to say is like grief is very normal. It's a normal reaction to a unwelcome change. And so that's one of the 4 principles I want to carry throughout this discussion, or essentially presentation. Number 2 is that it is not limited to death. And I think many of you may be acutely aware of that. And I will give you some definitions that even reinforce that point more. The third piece the third principle is that it is not a time-limited event. It doesn't happen and then unhappen. Grief is a process. It's not a race. Nobody wins the grief experience. It's a natural part of life. But the 4th principle is probably the piece that if you take nothing else away from tonight, I want you to take this one away. If you didn't know it already, that grief is unique and it's very individual. So nobody does grief right or wrong. Feelings aren't right or wrong. They just are. So when you think about that in mind, we all have ideas about how one should grieve, and I'll get to that in a minute. But think about grief as a fingerprint or a snowflake. No 2 fingerprints are the same, no two snowflakes are the same. And so everyone has their own journey, even within the same family, even within the same loss. Everyone shows up who they are, and there's a lot of judgment that happens. And I hope for you that this wasn't your experience if you're on here and you're someone who's experienced grief. But for a lot of the clients and families I see, that's what I hear. So that said, I want to move on to a couple definitions, and you'll see why I need these definitions because I'm setting the stage here. We're building the foundation, so bear with me. When we throw out the term grief, we think about all kinds of things. And if time did permit, I'd kind of have a discussion with you about what do you think grief is? What do you think? And that, but we don't. So I'm going to kind of just continue on and say that there's many different types of grief. And I just want to highlight a few of them. So one type of grief is anticipatory grief. And that's the grief that happens when no death has occurred. It's possibly happens when somebody is diagnosed with a terminal illness. So it's grief before someone has died. And that whole process before the experience of an actual death feels a lot like grief. Well, you know why? Because it is. It's a grief process. It's just nobody's died, so we don't often talk about that. I wanted us to remember that when I said it's not limited to death, that there's a lot of changes and unwelcome changes that happen, and we need to honor and recognize that process. Another kind of grief is disenfranchised grief, which is really important for our discussion. It's kind of where I see why we have so much difficulty when it comes to grief and loss. Disenfranchised grief is the kind of grief that happens when it's not recognized by society. So it's something that makes people uncomfortable. For example, death by homicide, suicide, a miscarriage, something that people are not really comfortable talking about in generally. I mean, I'm going to give generalizations. So it becomes disenfranchised because nobody gets to share their thoughts or process it because it's kind of like it might be taboo as opposed to a normal life cycle process experience. So that that grief becomes disenfranchised, and you'll see in a minute why that's an issue. There's lots of other terms I can talk about. One is prolonged grief disorder, which is actually a diagnosis in the DSM-5, a diagnostic manual for mental health issues. There's a lot of controversy over that. It's prolonged, it's grief that lasts very, very long and is debilitating, where you cannot function whatsoever. Not in the first month, not in the first 6 months, it has to be really, there's a lot of criteria, but it has to be over a year, and there's a lot of pieces to it. But just to know that that too is something that people will experience, and there's a good and a bad. Why is there controversy? Because on the one hand, if someone is experiencing that and now there's a label and a diagnosis, they might be able to get medical support and insurance might cover it. On the other hand, it scares me to think as a practitioner in the mental health field that if somebody is grieving over a year, I don't want to label them as something wrong. I just told you it's a normal life cycle process. We grieve because we're sad because somebody died. I don't want to put someone, define someone as having a mental health issue. So you can see where there's controversy there. So even if I threw out all those terms, so then what does it mean to have normal grief? What does normal grief look like? Well, for me, I think the obvious piece is the emotional piece, and it could be everything from sad, angry, frustrated, confused, disappointed, guilt. You name the emotion, it can fall under that. It can also be happy. It can also be relieved. And I say that with a whisper because most people will whisper it because they don't think, how can I say I'm relieved if somebody died? But the truth is, if somebody you love is in a lot of pain and suffering, and then they're no longer feeling that pain, you can be relieved. But people typically whisper it to me. But it also, so that's the emotional piece. But grief is a holistic experience. So it affects us not only emotionally, it affects us cognitively, how we think. And that's why we talk about brain fog and people feeling like they're confused and how come I not remembering things? So if you've had that experience of grief, it is actually perfectly normal. And for someone supporting someone who's grieving, Yeah, they're going to forget. Their mind is, they're just concentrating on trying to function and get through each day. So there's it's actual term, it's grief fog that happens and occurs. So you've got your emotion, you've got your cognitive, you've got physical. People can feel physical ailments that affect them as well. Spiritually, we'll hear more about that shortly, but grief can connect you very much to religion, grief, and not only spiritual in terms of religion, but any kind of spirituality. It can turn people very much close to, and that's where I hope they can find a lot of support and guidance, or sometimes it really, people turn away from it. It affects us spiritually, and then it also affects us socially. I tell people that and I have a lot of Corrieisms, so you'll hear them. Grief changes your address book. Some people, it's lovely and they get surrounded by a lot of support, and other people, yeah, not so much, or people that they thought would be there to support them are not there. So it's not unusual for that to happen. And that is a normal grief reaction. Okay. I'm going to breathe. You're breathing. We're all with me. Now I want to use the acronym that I created because people often say to me, that was your foundation for what I want to do, which is people say to me, how do I know how I'm going to grieve? And how do I know what to look for? What are the factors that influence someone's grief process? So after years of working with people and reading a lot and looking at the research, I came up with the way I remember things is often by an acronym. So I say it depends on how many scars you have. And scars stands for, S is for society, C is for circumstances. I'm going to go over each of these. A is for ancestry, R is for relationships, and S is for support system. So let me now backtrack. What do I mean by society? The first S in scars. Well, people are going to have their grief reactions and responses are very much predicated on how society sees that loss. So now you're going to understand why I explained disenfranchised grief, because when it's a normal life cycle process, an older person who died of an illness, that is kind of socially acceptable. It's sad, I'm not taking away how it feels, but it's socially acceptable. So people will be somewhat more comfortable and be able to talk about it. But when it is an accident, not an accident, homicide, suicide, miscarriage, people get really uncomfortable and they don't know what to say and they don't know how to act. So they don't respond or they ignore the person who's grieving. And please do not ignore the person who's grieving. It is already isolating enough. And so they feel like something's wrong with them, or they just feel incredibly lonely. And so how society reacts to someone's grief is going to impact how they're going to navigate their grief process. The second letter, the C, circumstances. I am very often asked, probably more than I should be asked, what's better, a long-term illness or a sudden death? And I'm like, neither. It's not a competition. Each has its own unique dynamic to it. When it's a long-term illness, you can, and you know someone is dying, that's when anticipatory grief comes in, where you start to grieve before the person dies. But with a sudden death, the shock of it is really very difficult for the person who is grieving, for the mourner. So it's not a better or worse. We don't, and please never compare griefs. I know sometimes it's hard, like you want to join, you want to support them. So you're like, yeah, I know my cousin had a miscarriage. Yeah, I know when my uncle died. That's making it about you. Keep it about them. Let them tell me how you're feeling rather than talk about it. We like to do, and we think, and I know I call it the umbrella of care. We think that we're doing something that is really supportive and helpful. And maybe for some it is, but often I hear from the mourners, I hear from people who are grieving. Yeah, like they're not listening. They're telling me, and it ends up being about them. So the circumstances around the death are yours are yours. Everybody had it worse. Everybody's is the worst. One woman said to me once, today at the funeral home, we're burying a 23-year-old, but and my husband was 84, and so I know he lived a long life. But you know what? If we're both wearing tight shoes, your pain is your pain and my pain is my pain. So let's not compare grief. So everybody has it the worst. The A in SCAR stands for ancestry. What do I mean by that? How you were raised and brought up, and how death was dealt with and spoken about in your house, in your environment, is how you carry on, and how you're role modeling about how you deal with death. And what you think. Was it swept under the rug and never, conspiracy of silence? Don't talk about it. Don't say anything. Funerals are no place for children. That some of you have heard John Ryder's story, how when his mom died, they put away all, he was 3 years old, put away all the pictures, never spoke his name again, never spoke her name again. That's what they believed was the right way to do it. But he only learned later, and we now know children need the space to grieve, hence why we have Myra's Kids Foundation and programs like that. So how you were raised and the messages you got about how to deal with grief and what to do. I just spoke today, I teach a course at McGill, and one of the students was saying that in her culture, women didn't go to the cemetery. So when her aunt died, they all assumed that they weren't supposed to go to the cemetery. And she said, but I want to go to the cemetery. Why can't I go to the cemetery? And in their family, they decided to go counterculture, and they went to the cemetery, but they knew that wasn't going to be a popular decision. It's interesting to me how everybody, even if you're not religious, I worked at Paperman's for 5 years. When someone dies, all of a sudden you become very, what do I do? How do I do it? Where do I go? And you follow certain things, because we need structure and we look for that. But I always say, you do you. And here's my thing, is if it's not illegal, immoral, or dangerous, then you do what you do, because according to somebody, you're going to be doing it wrong. But that comes from the ancestry piece of how is death supposed to be handled. And that can be fine, but if it doesn't resonate with you, that becomes a factor that influences how you're doing your grief process. Two more. R is for relationships. Whether it's a mother, father, sister, brother, aunt, cousin, uncle, child, friend, or pet. The relationship you have is not about who died. It's about the meaning of that relationship, who that person was to you. So some people, and I'm sure people on this call, some are closer with a friend than they are a relative. Some are, their pet is far more important, and we're not judging because we don't compare grief, right? But that relationship is going to have a significant impact on how you grieve, or how the person you are supporting grieves. Because for them, what is it? So, and I would say not only is it the meaning of that relationship, but it's either the relationship or the lack thereof, which we know can happen too. That's going to impact how somebody grieves. And then the last S is for support systems. And I used to think very naively. I would say to someone who was grieving, oh, do you have family here? Do you have family? And they would say yes. And I think they were fine. And of course, again, plenty of you probably know that just because you have family members does not mean you have support. Support is the key to navigating grief. And you are all very well placed to be able to support. By the fact that you're here on this phone call, I'm encouraged to know that you're here and able and willing and wanting to learn a little bit about how you can help someone through their grief process. And so I hope as I'm throwing this information out, something is resonating with you. But support can be a good friend, a listening ear. Listen, if we were supposed to talk more than listen, we'd have 2 mouths in 1 ear. That was Mark Twain. So let's listen and let's support people what they need. And let's be that support system, because it can be a rabbi, it could be the congregation, it could be a good therapist, a good group, a good program, a good foundation, an online group, some reading material, or a good friends or family member. But one needs that kind of support in order to help them navigate through their grief process. So now, do I have a little bit more time, Rabbi? Okay, so I did want to, because I always like to honor my commitments, and I said I was going to make sure that you did have some kind of an overall information, but some concrete interventions around navigating grief and how you can help, including this is just suggestions, you do you, but things you can say and not say. Because I'd say even with my course of master's level students, they're like, oh, I don't know what to say to someone. I'm just going to throw out some suggestions, but more importantly, what not to say. So I'm going to mix this together. First of all, doing what you're doing tonight, I call that psychoeducation. That's a great intervention because now you're learning about how you can show up for someone. And I think that that's great. I think we need to remember that we have to allow for all kinds of expressions of grief. Sometimes I may be very chatty, someone else may be quiet. That's okay. What do they need? It's not about what we need, it's about what does the griever need that will be helpful, and we'll go back to as long as it's not immoral, illegal, or dangerous. And sometimes I've been at it and it'll grow back. That's something we always want to respect someone's religious beliefs, as I mentioned earlier. We want to encourage the bereaved to tell their story. They need people to witness their grief. Grief cannot be fixed. It can only be carried, and we need to be able to carry it. And I know, and I get, it's not comfortable. Well, I'm going to say get comfortable with the discomfort because it's not about you. And if you really want to show up and help someone, you sit, you listen, and you let them talk. Or they don't talk, and you just sit and you sit quietly in that space with them, because we often want to try and fix it in, again, a kind way. But if you are someone on this call that is grieving, you know what I'm saying. Grief, it's not something that can be fixed. It just needs to be witnessed and carried. Identify secondary losses. Something that we forget when somebody dies is that I call that the primary loss. But there are all these secondary losses that occur as well. The loss of their role, the loss of, let's say it's a role of a partner, a role as a parent, all these changes that happen if they have to go back to work, if they have to stop working, things that show the loss of employment. There's a ton of secondary losses that occur when somebody dies. So you have the primary loss, but you have all these other changes. Remember them, explore them with the person, because I don't think people recognize that that's why it's so tough. It's not, I want to say I want to say there's the primary loss, but there's all these secondary losses. Then please remember triggers. Triggers are those moments in time where an anniversary, a birthday, a holiday, and I know some of them are obvious, but it is really helpful for you to remember that the holidays are coming up, and that's a hard time for somebody who's grieving. If you're someone on this phone call and you're grieving, I wish that everybody would remember. It would be in my perfect world, they would, but if not, tell them. It's called the direct ask. Hey, the holidays are coming up. I'm a little nervous. I'm feeling a little teary or a lot teary. Can you give me a call? I know you don't want to, but people want to help. They just don't necessarily know how to. So it's becoming comfortable for yourselves with asking and letting them know. And if you're someone who's supporting someone, remember that the holidays are hard. So please don't be complaining about something that you have to do. Oh, I got to have my whole family over. Yeah, some people would give their right arm to have their whole family over. So think about what you're saying and who you're saying it to. And those are all kinds of triggers. And so those are obvious ones. There's a lot of them that people don't recognize or not necessarily know. And there, you're not going crazy, you're grieving. And that's what happens when, and you can't even anticipate all of them. Then the other intervention, I would say, just to wrap this part up, is to identify ways of honoring the deceased, which is probably my favorite thing to do. I think we're all really well placed to do that. I think death ends a life, not a relationship. So if there's ways that you can help someone honor, and it can be anything from John Ryder starting a foundation to lighting a candle, making their favorite food, keeping some traditions. Sometimes traditions will change, but keeping some traditions, um, creating something out of their clothes. Some people make quilts, some people make teddy bears, some people make I have a great illustration of they used someone's toys and they made like a tablecloth, which was really cool. We can be very creative. You do you. Plant a tree, plant some flowers, put up a plaque somewhere that's meaningful to that person There's so many ways to do it. I just think that it's a great way of carrying the connection. So that's just something else that you can, if you are grieving, you can think about those kinds of things. And after, if we have time, I'll talk about more of them with you, or help somebody come up with some ways to honor that person. And then I just kind of wanted to wrap it up with, what do you say and what do you not? It's for me, it's more about what you don't say. So I'm just going to throw out a couple of them. So if you could avoid saying, I know how you feel, please do. You don't know how someone feels. We've all said these, by the way, but it's not something that someone who's grieving wants to hear. Please don't tell them they need to be strong. Like one of my clients said, what do I have to do? Lift the refrigerator? They don't need to be strong. It was God's will. If you believe that, great. But if somebody who's grieving doesn't, why would you say that to them? What it is, and now that you're in the headspace, think about what that sounds like. It sounds like you're justifying the death. Please don't do that. We don't need to have someone justify it. They don't. If they say to you, everything happens for a reason, it was God's will, whatever, that's great. They can justify all they want. I just don't want to tell them why something happened or didn't happen. Time heals all wounds. It's platitudes. They mean, people mean well, but they sound very empty to somebody who's grieving. And I had already mentioned things like when my grandmother passed away, when anything like that, you're not comparing, just be there for them. So on the other hand, and I'll wrap it up now, is you want to be very specific. How's your day going so far? How's your heart feeling? Not how are you? How's your day? How are you today? Be very, very specific. I know I can't change what's gone on, but I can listen and be here for you. I'm sad for you. Would you like to talk about it? Or just, I'm sorry. How can I be helpful? And please don't say, call me if you need anything. I know we all do it. I've done it. I still do it. But they're not going to call. Say, do you need me to carpool for you? Do you need me to pick up? I'm going to Costco. Can I pick up something for you? Be very concrete and very specific about it, because call me if you need anything is way, 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 way too broad, and people won't necessarily do it. So those are just some suggestions of words and ways that you can address and respond or approach somebody who's grieving. Altogether to say that grief is like an open wound. It heals, but the scar will always remain. And the deeper the love, the deeper the scar. So if you can understand that and that resonates with you, then I know that you will be a tremendous help in comforting the bereaved. I am done.
Wow, Corrie, that is such a wealth of information and beautifully presented in a very, very helpful and practical way. And pretty much everything that you said is grounded in Jewish sources and practices. And I'm going to have to be selective in just pointing out a few of them, because like you could take a couple of hours, I could take a couple of hours just responding to you. But let me try to mention some things from a Jewish point of view. The first is that the approach that Jewish law takes and Jewish practice takes to the subject of grief and mourning is everyone is unique. There is no one standard for everyone. There are certain guidelines and there are certain rituals that help guide us, especially in a time that we may be very confused or very emotional. There are people and guidelines that help us, but with the recognition that everyone is unique. Many people on Yom Kippur will be saying Yizkor, and Yizkor is an opportunity to remember people in our lives that we love who have passed away, and to pay them honor. It's also a time to express emotion. The practice in many synagogues is that people who are not saying Yizkor are asked to leave the sanctuary for that time. And the reason for that is the people in the room should be comfortable to express emotion and not feel that there are others who have no connection. Of course, what you said is correct. Everyone's grief is unique and there is no competition among pain, but tears are as much about healing as they are about hurting. And to be able to express tears, for others to be comfortable when we're expressing our tears of grief, that is something that is very important from a Jewish point of view. I'm just thinking to myself, I don't know at this moment how I'm going to be able to speak on Yom Kippur. I don't have that figured out. Okay. And also, Yizkor is important for another very crucial point that you made. Yizkor is about memory. The word means to remember. There is a recognition that people remember all sorts of things. Not everything that we remember is good. And Jewish tradition encourages a person to feel comfortable with multiple emotions. The person that passed away, every situation is different. There may have been good aspects. There may have been positive aspects. There may have been very negative aspects. And we are not asked to ignore any one part over the other. It's also a way for us to pledge money to tzedakah, to a good cause. That's actually what the words in Yizkor say. In the memory of this person, I pledge a gift to tzedakah. And this is one of the ways that we turn grief into action. And you mentioned there are many other ways. I just want to agree with that so much. Grief is an energy, and it's got to go somewhere. And it can either go inside and eat you up inside, or it can be directed outward. And if we can come up with a project or an idea or a plan of how to remember someone with some tangible action, that will be very helpful. I've told this story a number of times. My father passed away almost 12 years ago, and he was living in New York. I'm originally from Memphis, Tennessee. And our family was sitting Shiva in New York at my father's house, and a childhood friend came to visit. She and I had known each other literally since we were babies. And she came on the second day of the Shiva. And she knew my father, our families knew each other. And she said to me, have you decided what mitzvah you're going to accept upon yourself in memory of your father? And I said, I don't understand what you're talking about. The funeral was yesterday. No, I haven't thought about anything like that. And she said to me, you should, and now's the time to do it. And it was pretty incredible. And I listened to her advice, and I did think of something. It's very minor, but something that reminds me of my father. It's something that I do almost every day. Again, very minor, but it connects me to my father every single time I do it. And it's now over 11, almost 12 years since this happened. So being able to take this and to put it into some kind of constructive, positive way is the model that Yizkor is giving us. Mm. Judaism also recognizes that people have different responses when tragedy happens. There is an incredible detail of Jewish law that goes like this. According to Jewish law, when a person passes away, the mourners, the family members, are in a period between the death and the funeral called an onain. A person is called an onain. This is before the Shiva starts. And the rule of an onain is that a person is exempted from any positive commandments. So a person doesn't pray, person doesn't say any blessings, person doesn't do any positive actions to serve God. And there are two reasons that are given for that. One is because the mourners should be freed from any religious obligations in order to attend to arranging the details of the funeral, which can be overwhelming depending on the situation. But there's a second reason, which is incredible. And the second reason, it's mentioned in the Jerusalem Talmud, it is that perhaps, and again, each case is different, perhaps a person at the moment of losing someone they loved is so distraught, they may be angry with God, and they may not feel that they can do something that is an act of service to God. And therefore, Jewish law exempts that person to be understanding of the fact that a person may simply not be able to praise God or to thank God at a moment like that. What you said about disenfranchised grief is very important. It's something that in our community, it's something that I've spoken about a lot recently, specifically about a person who dies by suicide or a person who has a miscarriage, and also a person who has a pet that dies. And again, this idea that others may not recognize it, but that's not really the issue of what others recognize. The question is, what is the person going through? And so all of the guidance and suggestions and structures that Jewish law has can be molded to apply to any of these situations in a way that, and here's the key, that allows for the expression of emotion, but within a structured and supportive environment. After the funeral, a person has a period of sitting Shiva. And this is a time for 7 days when family members are together and they're in the house. People come to visit. And as you said, Corrie, it's mostly about stories. It's the opportunity for people to tell stories about the person they love. And it's an opportunity for others to tell them stories that they may not know. It's an opportunity to say, someone we love died. It's not life as normal. I'm not going back to work right now. Everything is on hold. I have to recognize that I'm affected by this, even if I don't think that I'm affected by it. But as you said, there is a fog. There is a fog of mourning, a fog of grief. And therefore we say, listen, there's a group that's going to help you. There's a community that's going to help through this. And so you're not going to be alone unless you choose to be alone. And you're going to be surrounded so that you can express your emotion, but you can do so enveloped by the arms of people that care about you, both family and friends and community. And this is one of the strongest things that a community can do for someone, is to show their support during this time. What you said, our rabbis give us guidance when we go to visit someone who's sitting Shiva. And it's so wise, and it connects with so much of what you said. Our rabbis tell us when a person goes to a family that's sitting Shiva, the protocol is you should come in, you should sit down, and you should be quiet. Don't start talking. Let the mourner talk about what they want to talk about. The mourner may want to talk about stories of the person that passed away. The mourner may need a respite from that and want to tell a joke. The mourner may want to just be quiet, silent. All of those things are okay. And especially in the situations where there is something that is not so common to us or not so well known to us. Let's say the circumstances of death are something that were very tragic. Someone died by suicide or murder. Then we want to give the person who's mourning the opportunity to direct the conversation. Do you want to talk about it? Please go ahead. I'm listening. I'm here to listen. Don't tell your own story. It's not about you. You cannot compare your grief to anyone else's grief. No, you do not know what they're going through. That is never, ever true. So be very careful about that. But if you do visit someone, let them take the lead in what they want to talk about. And then if you have a story about the person that passed away, you should tell it, because they may not know that. And that is something that mourners tell me is very, very helpful to them. When someone tells them a story that they didn't know, they're very appreciative of that. Another important practice that is extremely helpful is that there's a traditional practice that mourners say Kaddish. So this is a prayer, and it's interesting, the Kaddish prayer makes no mention of death, no mention of grief, no mention of memory. It's very strange how this prayer gets associated with mourners. So that's a subject for another time, but I'll just mention one detail of it. The general traditional practice is that Kaddish should be said within a minyan, within a quorum of people who are praying together. That's why in many cases, someone who's sitting Shiva and they're supposed to stay at home, the minyan comes to them. People come to prayer services at their house. After that, they may go to the synagogue to say Kaddish. But the words of Kaddish are written so that they only really make sense if they're being said within a group. Yes, if you're alone, there are other prayers that you can say, which is perfectly fine. Saying Kaddish encourages that you're going to be together with a group. And what happens, the dynamics that happen, and I see this as the rabbi of a synagogue so often, is when a person says Kaddish regularly, they develop a camaraderie. The people who are saying Kaddish, the people who are at the morning minyan, or even if it's just on Shabbos, there's a certain connection. You have to come out of the house. You have to get dressed. You have to be speaking to other people. So there is this encouragement to let the community be part of your life, not to recluse into your own life. And that's just one of the levels that Kaddish helps for. I want to agree with all of the do not say that you said. In particular, I just want to talk about the religious stuff. Do not say it is for the best, because you have no idea if it's for the best. And do not say it's God's will, because you have no idea what God's will is. The Talmud specifically says that a person is not allowed to say something like that to a person who has suffered a loss. And do not say, God only gives us what we can handle. That is, number one, not true. Number two, you have no idea why God gives someone or if God has given something to someone. And number three, almost every person who hears that feels worse after you've said it than before. So just do not say that. And if a person that you're visiting or speaking with criticizes God or expresses anger to God, you are not God's lawyer. You don't have to stand up for God. A person is allowed to be angry. They're very fine Jews who are angry with God. Abraham was angry. Moses was angry. Jeremiah was angry. They're very fine Jews that have been angry with God, that have questioned God. It's not your job to stand up on God's behalf. God can take care of God's self. I think that the key from a Jewish point of view is to recognize that we suggest there are stages. There's stages of grief. And we recognize they are not concrete delineated stages. What we try to do is we try to help a person proceed from one stage to the next, recognizing that there will be ups and downs. As you mentioned, Corrie, holidays, trigger events will be very difficult. And a person should never feel, oh my goodness, today I don't feel like getting out of bed and it's been 6 months. What's wrong with me? Well, if every day for 6 months you don't feel like getting out of bed, you might want to speak to a professional about that. But if something happens to trigger and you feel miserable and you feel terrible and you can't get things done and your mind is in a fog, that's normal. What we want is that generally a person should be able to progress. That's the custom that many people have at the end of Shiva, that the mourners take a walk outside. They walk around the block. It's actually a practice that's not mentioned in classical Jewish sources, but the idea is we want to help the mourner recognize, okay, we finished this period, it's time for the next period. One of the great rabbis in the late 1800s, Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, says something. He says that when you build the cemetery, it's preferable that the cemetery should be outside the boundary of the city. Now, I know that I believe Behringer Cemetery, when it was first built, was outside uh, the boundaries of the city, or was at least surrounded by farmland. Okay, that changes over time. But the idea is, yes, you can go back to the cemetery. You can visit someone at the cemetery whenever you want, but we don't want to have it right in front of you all the time. Here's what we hope for. This is what we call nechama, consolation. And it's a process that, as you said, Corrie, it takes a long time, it's very gradual, and everybody is unique. But the process is like this. For every person that's passed away, every family member has sad things that they remember, the loss, the pain, what they don't have, the suffering beforehand, and happy things to think about. The blessing of having that person in our lives, what I gained from that person, how much that person loved me, what that person did for others. Everyone has a combination of those sad and happy memories. It is normal that towards the beginning of the process, the overwhelming expression will be one of sadness. That is normal. What we hope for over time gradually is that the balance shifts. The sadness will never go away. As you said, Corrie, grief does not end, but it becomes more balanced so that, yes, I'm 11 years, 12 years later. People could be 30, 40. I'm in shul. There are people who are saying Yizkor for someone who died 40, 50 years ago, and there are tears. Yes, the tears will still be there. But there's also the joy. There's also the blessing that I recognize. So there's a more healthy balance that we hope a person will come to gradually over time and hopefully the Jewish practices, Jewish thought, Jewish suggestions about this will help a person along that path. So I want to first just give Corrie an opportunity, if you want to take, let's say, 2 minutes to respond to what I said, if there's anything you want to add or change. Okay, so let me, I'm going to look at the chat. So let me, okay, so 1 second. Okay, okay, so I was sent a direct message, but I'm going to try to say this in a way that that is more general. Corrie mentioned this. To say to someone, let me know what I can do to help. Call me if you need anything. Those are nice sentiments, but as Corrie said, it is rare that a person will follow through on that. And don't forget the person when Shiva is over. Very often, the most difficult time a person will have with grief is after Shiva, when everyone's gone home, everyone's back in their own lives, especially an older person, the children, they may be back at work, they may be back with their families, and now nobody is calling. That's the time to call. And just a very simple thing to do, make a note to yourself on a monthly basis. Give a call. How are you? Would you like to get coffee? Is there a story you want to tell me? Um, and it goes on and goes on. If you're able to call someone who lost someone around a holiday, and it could be years later, but as Corrie said, it will mean so much to them to be able to do that. So don't forget about a person. When the Shiva is over, that's when they need you the most. So Corrie wanted to say something, so Corrie, go ahead. Oh, you have to, 1 second.
I was stuck. I was stuck and I couldn't unmute myself. Thank you. I call it what you said. I call it after 3 months. And those of you who have experienced it will probably know, as I say, when the casseroles stop coming. I love what you just said, though. People just, you think, yeah, they're fine now. It's long enough. They'll be okay. And no, that's really when people may need the support. Remembering is so touching. It might, maybe you put it in your agenda or just to remember, like I said, around holidays, but also different days that might be a Mother's Day, a Father's Day. It means so much to the person just to have that acknowledgement.
Right.
So
Very important. Thank you. I do want to, I want to add just one or two short things. But again, so don't just say, call me if you need anything. Be specific. So I remember reading this story years ago. Someone passed away, and it was a close friend, and he showed up at their house the night of the funeral, and he said, the person that passed away had a large family. So there was a spouse and several children. So the friend shows up at the door, and he said, I'm here to shine everybody's shoes. And he sat down on the floor. He took the shoes of every single family member. They're all going to be going to this funeral tomorrow. Nobody thought about shining their shoes. He just sat and shined shoes. Make it specific. Recognize or try to recognize what that person might need. If a person is grieving and they have young children, it can be tremendously helpful. I would love to take your children out to lunch, or take them to a movie, or let me do something with your kids. Or make it practical, make it something concrete. That is when you can have the biggest impact. All right, I just want to see if there are any other questions or comments. I will add something about Yizkor, as that's coming up for many of us on Saturday, on Yom Kippur. So this is something that I think about a lot. When I'm saying Yizkor, and I'm remembering those people in my life that have passed away, and as I said before, there are positives and there's not as positives. For some people, Yizkor can be very complicated, and we need to acknowledge that. For some people, it may be impossible. There are extreme situations where a person was abused by the person that died, and a person needs to take care of their own emotional needs first. If doing one of these acts of traditional Jewish practice is harmful to your own emotional health, don't do it. Don't do it. But one of the things to think about is, at some point, hopefully not for a long time, someone will be saying Yizkor for me. What will they remember about me? I know what I remember about my father, who passed away. I know what I remember about my grandparents, who passed away. What will someone think about me? And what do I have to do now to have that be what I would want remembered by me? I want to add something else that relates specifically to Yom Kippur. The technical word that we use for this holiday is Yom Kippurim. So Yom Kippur means a day of atonement. Kippurim means atonement plural. What's the plural of atonement? Our sages say atonement for those who are alive and atonement for those who have died, because we believe that a person is held accountable for their actions during their lifetime. So, okay, I can understand that. And so a person who's a mourner, who is saying Yizkor, is asking God to forgive any of the trespasses that their loved one did during their lifetime. Okay, I could understand the first year after the person passed away. It makes sense to ask God for this atonement for the person that passed away, if that's how you feel. But the second year, what's the purpose? I mean, they didn't do anything else. nothing new happened, right? Once a person passes away, that's it. There are no actions. But there's a very, very important idea here. It's true for all of us. We do things and they have an effect on others that may be visible now, but it may only be visible later. And in some cases, the ripple effects of our actions are still being felt years later and may affect us in ways that we never imagined when they originally happened. A person could do all sorts of things. I don't want to give any examples because I don't want to embarrass anyone. And it's true in a positive way also. A person can set something in motion, and years later it comes out that it's something that is so helpful and so constructive and so beautiful. So the consequences of a person's life do not end with their last breath. They continue to reverberate and ripple outward. And that's one of the ideas that we have on Yom Kippur. Okay, so we're near the end of the time that I had, and I don't see, okay, so someone sent something to me, so I will respond directly to that person. So here's what I want to say. Corrie Sirota, my goodness, thank you so much. You are a source of such wisdom and help in a very practical sense. I am honored that you're here. You have benefited all of us, and I just want to thank you for being generous with your time, your expertise, and also to pay tribute to the amazing, incredible work you do with Myra's kids and the other people that you help. Thank you so much.
I'm so grateful to be here. And as you see that I hope I didn't sound too flippant with it because I'm very passionate. That's the one thing that people say. I'm very passionate about what I do and what I believe that if there's a way that I can help people not feel better, just navigate their grief and help others, then there's nothing better for me to. So thank
Amazing.
you for
Well,
giving
this
me
is a
that
great start.
opportunity.
This is really going to help a lot of people. And I thank you very much. So I want to wish you, Corrie, and everyone here, Shana Tova, a very happy, healthy, inspiring new year.